Bonsoir tout le monde. Je suis ravie d'être parmi vous ce soir. Je suis Lenore Harris, présidente des Amis de la Bibliothèque de McGill, et j'ai le grand plaisir de vous accueillir cet événement très spécial. Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Hugh MacLennan Lecture, presented in partnership between the Friends of the McGill Library and Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival. Tonight's program is being offered both in person and virtually. Greetings to the hundreds of viewers from afar. McGill University is situated on land which has long been served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked this territory where people of the world now gather. The Friends of the Library is a volunteer group of passionate and committed McGill Library advocates. Founded in 1989 by loyal library supporters and benefactors, our mission is to nurture community interest in the library, promote the importance the library plays in both student life and the greater community, and highlight its many unique world-class resources and collections. The Friends have championed and progressed two major parallel infrastructure projects, a new collection center and the Fiat Lux project, both of which will transform the quality of services and spaces that the library offers. The Hugh MacLennan Lecture is one of 3 free public annual lectures offered by the Friends of the Library. The 2 other events are the F.R. Scott Lecture and the Shakespeare Lecture, which is held in partnership with Stratford Festival. Both typically take place during the fall semester. Tonight's event was founded in 1992 to honor the great Canadian Governor-General's 5-time award-winning novelist and McGill English professor, Hugh MacLennan. McGill University's rare books and special collections is the repository of MacLennan's papers, which includes correspondence, 2 unpublished novels, the drafts of 2 solitudes and the watch that ends the night, and many articles. This past Tuesday, April 23rd, was World Book and Copyright Day, a day designated by UNESCO and international associations of writers, publishers, and libraries to celebrate books. It was also the anniversary of the birth and death of William Shakespeare. On this day, PEN International and its centers denounced the alarming surge in book bans worldwide, including Belarus, Brazil, China, Hungary, the Russian Federation, Turkey, and the USA, where authorities are attempting to stifle dissent and criticism by censoring literature, persecuting writers, and suppressing inconvenient truths. Burhan Sonmez, PEN International president, said that through book bans, authorities attempt to suffocate the essence of freedom and urged people to let literature be our shield against oppression, a beacon of resilience in the darkness. Tonight, Friends of the Library has the distinct pleasure of presenting a roundtable discussion on book banning and their impact on Canadian communities. To be clear, book banning is not new. In fact, the practice is centuries old. But over the past 4 years, an unprecedented wave of book bans and book removals has occurred in schools and libraries across the US and Canada. In fact, between July and December 2023, more than 4,300 books were removed from the shelves of classrooms and libraries. Book challenges frequently come from a place of fear, ignorance, and misunderstanding. Subjects most often targeted include sexual identity and sexual assault, and race and racism. The Handmaid's Tale, Such As My Beloved, Underground to Canada, Of Mice and Men, and Hugh MacLennan's Barometer Rising are some of the most popular banished titles. Much of this activity is often connected to political pressure or legislation designed to restrict and reshape teaching led by conservative parents and community groups that organize online, such as Mums for Liberty and Utah Parents United. While not a regular occurrence in Canada, increasing discourse online in the US is propelling the topic to this side of the border. This evening, our panel of esteemed speakers will address Canada's challenges. Michelle Arbuckle is an eminent figure in the library and book sector, serving as the Executive Director of the Ontario Library Association and Chair of Canada's Book and Periodical Council. She is characterized by her unwavering commitment to advancing literacy and ensuring that libraries remain vibrant hubs of intellectual freedom. Brendan DeCaires is Executive Director of PEN Canada, a nonprofit that promotes literature, defends freedom of expression, and helps exiled writers to establish new lives in Canada. He has headed PEN Canada's programs and special projects for a decade, editing and co-authoring country studies of Mexico, Honduras, India, and Guatemala. Author Robin Stevenson is an award-winning Canadian writer of more than 30 books for kids and teens who has been personally affected by book challenges. Her books include Kid Activists, Record Breaker, and My Body, My Choice, The Fight for Abortion Rights. Her books have won the Silver Birch Award, the Sheila A. Egoff Award, and a Stonewall Honor, and been finalists for Governor General's Literary Awards, the Lambda Literary Awards, and many Reader's Choice Awards. Robin was the Book and Periodical Council of Canada's champion of free expression for 2022. In 2023, she was awarded the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence. The discussion will be moderated by Joseph Hafner, our very own McGill Associate Dean of Collections at the McGill Libraries. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lenore, for that nice introduction. I was so glad to see so many people here today, and I think you're in for a nice treat. We're going to have a nice discussion here about a difficult topic and something that the panel feels passionate about, so it's going to be a great evening, I hope. Yes, I'm mixed up with this because I'm part of the International Federation of Library Associations. We're having a mini conference in Mexico City on censorship. It's been, as Lenore said, it's been an issue that's been really surging in the last couple years, and so we thought it was time to have a 2-day symposium in Mexico City the first week of August, and it's called Unshelving Voices, and we're going to bring in speakers from around the world to talk about it, but there's a lot from North America because it's a big issue here. And tonight, I think I have a vague notion of what we'll cover through here, but we're going to go where the journey takes us. So we'll see how this goes. But we're going to talk some about setting the stage, about the differences between censorship in Canada and the U.S. We're going to talk about maybe some history behind it. As Lenore said, this isn't a new thing. It's been going on for a long time, but how it's different and where we came from in the past. And think about what's happening today and the challenges we're facing, and then maybe what are some calls to action? What are some things we can do to move forward? So without further ado, who wants to get us going about what's the difference between the Canadian context, or what do we want to say about that? And even just choosing the name of this program tonight, we had some issues about what are the right words that we want to use in Canada about this. So would you like to talk?
I'm happy
Brendan?
to lead off.
Oh, great.
I think when the Second Amendment and the First Amendment are jostling, that's a very different scenario. The people who turn up to library challenges in the US are not literary scholars. They are angry conservative activists. They are there to provoke. They're the same people who dox you and troll you and target you. Robin's book was they're organized groups that go after you. That is an advertisement of what is coming to Canada. And the idea that if you fail to get a book removed in the library, you go to the local politicians, you go to the state politicians. These are strategies that are paying off in spades in the US. So the fact that they're not here is no reason to be reassured. So this is a much kinder, more forgiving culture historically, but all of these ideas are viralized online, and I think that the US is the coming attraction, and that's why we should take it seriously. So we don't have the same mechanisms. We have challenges. We don't have bans. We have a much more tightly organized process, and thank God we don't have the Second Amendment. But the same type of people have been growing emboldened over the last couple of years, and this is one of the cultural spaces that they're after.
And I'll just say, in terms of the terminology that we use, the original title of this talk tonight was Book Challenges, I believe, but none of you found that sexy enough, so it was changed to Book Bans. And I think, as we find with much in Canadian culture, we look to what the Americans are doing and then we adjust. But so the Americans do call it book banning. We call it challenges because that's what it is. It is when a member of the public, or in a school, the parent might flag a book and request that it be reviewed, and it's called a challenge, because in most of those cases it isn't actually banned, it isn't actually removed from the collection. It might be recategorized or stickered or moved to a different place, or more often than not, nothing at all. The person is communicated with, is heard, and then the book goes back on the shelf exactly where it came from. But I think it is an important issue. I have a little bit of a different perspective from Brendan. I don't think that we're necessarily seeing exactly the same type of situation here yet in Canada as we're seeing in America, but I think it's giving us time to collect and prepare and to train our library people on how to make sure we're prepared for it. And I think I deal a lot on a day-to-day basis with people who work in public libraries. Can I just get a sense, how many people here are actually trained library people? Okay, so there's a few of my people here, good. I'm gonna make eye contact with you throughout. Where was I going? Yes, I regularly have contact with CEOs in public libraries and school librarians as well, and I'm not hearing there's an overwhelming number of challenges coming through the system yet. But what I do know is, together with the Center for Free Expression and CFLA, we're working on making sure every library is prepared with policy, that every person who works in a library is prepared through training to have those conversations and those difficult interactions with people, and to be prepared for that tension that occurs when we're talking about things like intellectual freedom. So, yeah.
About the author's point of view?
Yeah, when it comes to differences between Canada and the US, as a Canadian author, and I think this is true for most Canadian authors, my books are sold on both sides of the border, and I work with publishers on both sides of the border. So even when the challenges are actually happening in the United States, they still have a big impact on authors in Canada. It affects our ability to get our books to readers, to get our books to kids in schools, which is a big part of the market for kids' books. And I think one of the concerns that a lot of authors have is that it can potentially affect the kinds of books that are getting published as well. That, if book sales of certain types of books start to drop, is that going to affect what publishers are willing to acquire? And so those issues are not sort of restricted to one side of the border, because that's not how our book sales or our work with publishers generally works. But definitely, we're seeing more challenges in Canada than we were. My first challenges came from the States, and I'm now starting to hear about books being challenged on this side of the border. And certainly just echo what both Brendan and Michelle has said, that we're seeing what's happening in the States. We're seeing it start to happen here as well, that a lot of the challenges that are happening are very much fueled by bigotry and hate, and that doesn't stop at borders. And so I think we have definitely reason to be vigilant and to be prepared with policies and so on, but also to recognize that these challenges aren't just about books. They're about the identities of the people those books represent. They're about the identities of the people writing those books. So these are very much tied in with issues of human rights. And I think that we can do what we can to push back, not just on the challenges themselves, but on the conversations that give rise to them.
Great. Just thinking about some of the historical context, you had a good story, Michelle, about you know what it is.
I do.
Yeah.
Story number 3A on our list.
I think so.
In terms of the history of Freedom to Read Week and when this all started, centuries ago, of course, this has been happening. But in Canada, we've been celebrating Freedom to Read Week for 40 years. And it is a celebration, which is a different tone from our colleagues to the south who have banned Book Week. But Freedom to Read Week started in 1984 after the book The Diviners by Margaret Lawrence. Any readers of The Diviners out there? Great. It's been a while, but it's a good one. It was challenged in 2 high schools in Peterborough, Ontario, and they had a process. It went before a panel where it was reviewed and assessed, and at that time, the panel agreed that it did not, have language that was inflammatory, as such it should be removed. So it was to be back in the classroom in the English curriculum. And this went on for 9 years, this battle. I believe that Margaret Lawrence died shortly thereafter. Decisions were made, which is so unfortunate. But even though the book at the initial outset had been cleared of any wrongdoings, it was then only taught by one teacher in one high school after that point because there was a bit of a stink on it. There was a smudge on that book. And so we know this happens. We call it shadow banning, where a book gets a reputation, and rather than having to deal with then irate parents or readers or others in authority, the book is just quietly removed. And Canada does have a history of quiet censorship. We're not immune to this. We know that it happens. And so that is where this all, for us anyway, in terms of Freedom to Read Week, started back in 1984 with the Diviners. And we know these are issues we still continue to challenge today, whether it's shadow banning or outright banning, or outright challenges, I should say. So.
Yeah. Robin, would you want to share what was one of your first books to get challenged, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure what was the first. I think it might have been, so in 2019, I have a book called Kid Activists, which is a collection of biographies of different historical figures, and it came out with a US publisher, and they had sent me on tour. So this actually did happen in the States. I was in California for a week and then Illinois. And for one of my school visits, I was mainly doing school visits. The night before I was set to visit a school near Chicago, I got a call from my publisher letting me know that my school visit had been canceled by the school district. And the reason they had canceled was that one of the activists in the book was Harvey Milk, a gay activist. So I was sort of continued with the tour, but I also wrote a letter to the school district about my concerns about that and about how harmful I thought that decision was and the message that it sent to young people in their community to suggest that a well-known American figure couldn't be written about, couldn't be talked about, his work couldn't be shared in their school district because he was gay, and that sent a message to their students that was really harmful. Now, in that case, in Illinois at the time had actually just passed some legislation which had not yet taken effect, which was set to require schools to include LGBTQ history in their history curriculum. That legislation wasn't set to take place to take effect until the fall. But there was a lot of interest because of that, and so I was actually invited back down to give a public talk on the book. So I wasn't able to go to the school where I had originally been slated to talk, but I was able to visit the community, and many of those kids and families came out to the public talk. So I had some great conversations with kids and families. One of the things that I learned from that was I actually heard from hundreds of people in that community who were really upset about the visit being cancelled. I heard from people whose kids had graduated from schools in that community. I heard from young people who had graduated from schools in that community themselves. I heard from a psychologist working in that community, and I heard so many stories about bullying, homophobic bullying in particular, in schools in that community, and people who were really seeing a need for change. And some groups actually did organize in the wake of this and start to do some work to try to make change happen in their community. It was a group of high school students who were, making T-shirts that demanding that their school district listen to queer students, and there was a lot of activism that came out of it on a local level. And I think what I took from it really was just that, when these things happen, it's often a very small number of very vocal people who issue these challenges. In this case, the school board unfortunately caved to that pressure, but it did not represent the majority of the people in that community. Most people don't want to see books banned. Most people don't want to see authors' visits canceled. This just actually happened last week to another author, this time in Pennsylvania, where a school district voted to cancel his visit because of his activism and his so-called lifestyle, another gay author. So it continues to happen, but it's not something that I think most people support. And when it does happen, there is often a wave of support. I think that for the many, many, many people who are silently opposed to this, when these things happen locally, it provides some impetus to speak up and take action. And that's what I've seen in Canada as well, that when we have had incidents of book challenges, we've also had many people speaking up in opposition to that.
Brenda, do you have a story about censorship with the authors?
I have dozens, but
Yeah.
I will try to be brief. There are two in particular. I think that freedom of expression has become an increasingly difficult sell in the culture that we are in. And there was a very interesting book written by Kenan Malik, a British writer, called From Fatwa to Jihad. And it looked at the impact of the Rushdie affair in British Muslim approaches to freedom of expression. So originally, as you will recall, there was very little response to the Satanic Verses. Then it was shortlisted for the Booker, and then suddenly there were protests in Bradford. They set the book on fire, and then the world was on fire because the Iranians picked it up and so on. And at the time, most British Muslims felt this was outrageous, that you would allow a British writer to insult a religion this openly. Why should he be protected? But as Malik points out, 15 years later, when many of the same people wanted to protest the coffins of British soldiers coming back from fighting against Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were also protected by the very same law. So it took a 15-year arc for them to appreciate, okay, this does shield us in our moment of outrage. And I think that we have decreased the cycles in which people process freedoms. So we are now in a moment of perpetual outrage where nobody pauses to absorb what are the implications of the freedom I am curtailing right now. And the other point I would make about censorship is in this wonderful book that Kevin Birmingham wrote, The Most Dangerous Book in the World, a publishing history of Ulysses. And if you see, even when he was trying to publish Dubliners, Joyce found it almost impossible because there were a line here that said something bad about the Queen and so on. And the only people that would take a chance on publishing the early chapters of Ulysses were these deeply strange, eccentric literary types running these little magazines. There were suffragettes, and they were the modern equivalent of the queer and trans activists. They were willing to consider any strange literary form, any new idea. And I just think Ulysses would never get written today because we are killing off those types of publications. We are so intolerant. They'd never get funding. They'd never be circulated. And the American publishers of Ulysses had to fight the American Post Office which was in many ways a totally fascist institution and went after every new idea that it didn't like. But you think that, that's 100 years ago, and we're probably in a more intolerant world now, and that should give us pause, because we think we've advanced a great deal, and I don't think we have.
Maybe now's some time to think. What is the landscape right now? What are the challenges we're seeing in the publishing and library land?
Well, library land's different than publishing land, but
yeah.
I think as much as challenges have been occurring forever, as long as we've been tracking them, what we're finding is over the past few years, the trends have been shifting alarmingly towards queer content. So books about queer experience from queer authors, featuring queer characters, are the ones that are being flagged at all levels. Children's books, teen books, adult books. Those are the experiences that we're seeing. I hate to use the word bad faith, but because a challenge is a legitimate piece of working in a library, of living in a democratic society. You have the right to voice a challenge to a book, to any book. Doesn't mean you get the right to remove that book from everyone else's access. But what we're seeing is a number of challenges that are of bad faith, of organized by groups, specifically about these books. And more often than not, what we're learning, especially out of the States, the lessons we're learning from them, is these are organized groups that in most cases are not even reading the book. So they're pulling one experience or one four-letter word out of 500 pages, and that taints the entire book. But we know that this dangerous recipe of ignorance and willingness to do paperwork and organize is really causing such havoc in the system and putting some libraries. We were just talking before that apparently Ron DeSantis has now said in Florida, you only have the right to challenge one book a month because there's so much chaos happening in their library systems. But that is an organized attempt to shut down an institution like the library, is to just cover them in paperwork and bureaucracy, and it is a legitimate fear, and something that I think many libraries are taking into account with their policies is how far do we take this, how much staff power has to go into this work. But back to your original question, it is mostly, it is very alarming to see that shift, because we did used to see challenges of all types. Years ago, it's actually quite amusing to go back and look at challenges. It's almost quaint in a way. Challenges from the 80s and 90s. There was one book that was a children's book. You might know this one. And the person, it was in Nova Scotia, they challenged it because it refuted the existence of the Easter Bunny, and they didn't want their child to know there wasn't really an Easter Bunny. If you've got children in the room, please mute me. But so spoiler alert, there's no Easter Bunny. And there was one that I've been looking at this work by Alvin Schrader, who wrote a book in I think it's the early 90s. And he kept flagging this one book that was getting challenged called Lizzie's Lion. I think it's not Maurice Sendak, but it's adjacent. And essentially Lizzie has a lion, and only she knows the secret word to call off the lion. The word is lion, spoiler alert. And a burglar comes and breaks in the middle of the night. And at the last page of the book, Lizzie and the lion bury the head of the burglar in the backyard. And it's a horrifying story, but it's just so cute and quaint when you read it. But for me to tell you, at the end of this book, a child murders a burglar and buries his head in the backyard. That sounds like something you might want to ban, but if you read the whole thing, it's actually a lovely bit of prose, and the illustrations are so good. I highly recommend you go and read it. This is what I hope the outcome of our conversation today. You're going to go away with a book list of all of these books that you have to go and request from your library and read.
Yeah, I think sometimes too in the past there was like specific books people would get upset about. They'd come in and be mad about one thing. One that I remember from the 80s was Madonna's book, or maybe that was the early 90s. It came out, and I know at my public library, we locked it in a special closet. You had to come and ask for it. You could only use it at the desk, and it became a funny thing. But now it seems that sometimes they come with a whole list. There's a whole group of books or 100 books that they want to ban all at once, and then it creates chaos for the place.
Well, and you're insinuating in that scenario that someone's coming into the library with those challenges, and that is a valid thing that happens every day in libraries. But what we're seeing with these organized attempts is it's happening through the internet. So they're using online forms, or they're emailing these forms in, and so that is a piece of the policy at work here. Is how do you know this challenge is coming from someone in your community? How do you know it's valid? How do you know they've read the book? You know, it's a conversation that we have to be involved with people, as opposed to just words behind a form.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that. I've just finished reading a book by James LaRue, who was the head of the Office of Intellectual Freedom for the American Libraries Association. And he's handled something like 900 challenges over his career. And one of the more amusing ones, which Michelle's story just reminded me of, was somebody'd read a reworking of Red Riding Hood, in which the wolf eats her and the grandmother. And then a woodsman turns up and slashes the belly of the wolf open and saves Red Riding Hood. All of this deviating from the original. And at the end of it, Grandma sits down and has a drink. And someone lodged a complaint over alcohol consumption, and which I thought was a new level of reading. And James LaRue takes it very seriously. He reads it and he says, "Listen, mate, Grandma had a really bad day. If I had gone through this, I think I would have a drink." And he dismissed it. But he makes a more serious point, which is that the two flashpoints in these challenges that he's had to manage, and he notes that after November 2021, there's a huge uptick, which speaks to what Michelle is talking about. They're no longer organic challenges. They're being coordinated online. They frequently involve books that the library doesn't actually have in its stock, but it appears on the digital catalog, which gives it away. And he makes this suggestion that culturally, these the young adult section and the children's section become these flashpoints at the very moment when there is a massive publicity around sex abuse in the church, in both the Christian churches and the Catholic Church. So there is a feeling of paranoia in the culture that institutions that should have protected children have abused them. And then Mr. LaRue makes the point that he's not aware of hundreds of librarians who have engaged in any form of abuse, but they are being held liable because people want to find someone to blame. And the institutions that should have been held legally to blame have covered their tracks so effectively that there's this rage in the culture. And instead of dealing with parenting as the problem, they've selected libraries and librarians and books as the flashpoints. I think there's quite a lot in that reading.
Yeah, and it's frightening. Some of the new laws in the U.S. want to put librarians in jail or fine them $10,000 if they've put a book that includes sexual content in the hands of children.
Which is particularly alarming when you look at what is considered sexual content, or what some of the people who are challenging books consider to be sexual content. So I have a board book for babies, which has like less than 100 words and has photographs of babies in it. But one of the photos has two women holding a baby. And the book's pride colors and follows the colors of the pride flag. That book was caught up in a book challenge situation by a group in the States that literally held a barbecue, advertised online for people to come and fill in requests for reconsideration forms or book challenge forms at a barbecue. They provided babysitting and beer while people were filling in these challenge forms for hundreds of books they haven't read. And after the barbecue, they took over 500 challenge forms to the library, over 130 books, all with LGBTQ characters. And somebody did a Freedom of Information request, so I read some of the complaints. And my board book, which starts a bright red heart, what is it? Bright red heart, a little star. I love you just the way you are. Like that's the tone of the book, and it's photos of babies. Was described as obscene, pornographic, and sexually explicit. So the level of dishonesty. And the fact that people aren't reading these books at all and are considering anything with LGBTQ representation to be obscene is particularly worrying when you hear the same language of obscenity being used then to potentially criminalize librarians who are sharing these books.
So, with PEN, what kind of work are you doing with authors that are facing these challenges?
We had a retreat earlier this year, and we decided that this is a priority for our centre. Part of the reason we've not done as much on it as we would like to do is there's a good reason, which is we're not yet in the same situation as our sister centre, PEN America, is, because they have catalogued over the last year, I think, 4,000 challenges, and those have also involved states passing laws, and it's gone into schools as well. So that's a far, far more complex thing than anything that has happened here. There have been a few incidents here, but I think this is not yet a culture war, and it is in America. And the reason it won't become a culture war is because, hopefully, is that Canadians will recognize what is at stake here. Robin made a very interesting point, which James LaRue makes as well, which is that whenever a book is challenged, it is, when action is taken against a controversial book, it's removed from a shelf, there is an assumption, a presumption on the part of the bureaucrats doing that they speak on behalf of a community. And a community is the only way to refute that. So an NGO, a statement, a columnist is not enough. People have to turn up. People have to say, no, I want a book about why black children have a harder time making it in this society. I want a book that recognizes that there are queer and trans people in this society. And if they don't fight for it there, then it just keeps escalating. And I think that's what's at stake. How you set about tackling that is a larger question. But I do think that we have become collectively much too censorious. And the idea that you should go to a library, he has a wonderful quote, a great library should have something to offend everyone, which I think is how we should think about these things. And you know, I make a real effort to read things that distress me deeply. And I don't just mean human rights reports. I mean, I go out of my way. I'm deeply read in conservative writers and so on. And I find it interesting because they frequently change my mind. And this ought to be the goal of a liberal democracy, to find the best ideas by triage. And if you lose the willingness to consider these things, which is what you do every time you just accept a challenge or launch a challenge without reading the book, or launch 3,600 challenges digitally, you are a step closer to the political abyss, because you have surrendered the right of a democracy to process counter pressures to its orthodoxies. And it's also, I think, historically and culturally illiterate to behave like this, because, you know, the counterculture of today is the first draft of tomorrow's culture. And if you are so intent on shutting it down, you are engaging in an act of cultural sabotage that you will be liable for when your children have nothing but a sort of utterly bland, recycled culture to live with. But I won't go on, because this is my natural default, and I'm going to skew us all. So I'll pass it on.
I'll just say, I think it's an interesting conversation. I'm happy to be with book people, and as much as I adore being here with Robin, whom I love, on a panel with her, I think it's a bit of a crutch to lean on authors to defend their work in these instances. And for the library people who are watching, as you know, as much as I know it is, and there's an instinct to reach out to the author or tag them on social media when a challenge comes through or when you see their work being challenged in some way. I would encourage you not to do that, because there's so much emotional labor that goes into this response and this need to defend your work constantly and respond to these challenges. I think we need to find different ways. Here at McGill, you're training future writers, and I don't know, it's a whole other level to then start training them on PR and how to defend yourself when you're attacked. That I don't know that it enhances the art to go down that avenue, but it worries me if so. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's. I just went to a media training that I think it was Pen America for other, and every library in Pen America we're doing for authors. But for me, it's not so much about defending my book specifically as the fact that I am a writer means I have a lot of opportunities to talk to young people and to spend a lot of time in schools, to do writer-in-residence stuff, and just talking to groups of teens. And teens are the group that is most affected by this. The largest category of books that are being challenged and in the States being banned are books in high school libraries. So, teens are hugely affected. I think they're a group whose voices should be heard more. But when I talk to teens, and they talk about what books mean to them, what it means to them to find people like themselves on the page, to find families like theirs on the page, to be able to learn about the world through books, to learn about different ideas and experiences, the way in which books serve as a safe place to explore and experiment and learn, and how big a role books play for them in learning to think critically, figuring out what they think, figuring out how they're going to be in the world. I absolutely want to, anytime anyone hands me a microphone, I want to talk about the importance of books to teens and to defend teens' rights to read and to defend their rights to choose their own books. These are young people who are on the verge of becoming adults. These are people who have jobs, who drive cars. These are people who are more than capable of choosing their own books and thinking critically about what they read. One teen I spoke to recently talked about how deeply disturbing and deeply disrespectful she finds it when people use the language of parental rights, and how much that completely disregards and dismisses the autonomy and agency of young people to choose their own books. So for me, it's not so much, I don't feel so much like I have to defend my books. I feel like people can read my books, you can like them, you can not like them, you can criticize them, whatever, that's fine. I've written them, they're out there in the world, they're their own thing. But I absolutely want to take advantage of any opportunity I have to defend freedom to read and to defend the rights of young people.
On that vein, is there something you guys would like to share about what can we do, or what gives you hope, or how can we respond to these challenges?
I just want to go back to the last answer, because I side with Michelle on this. I don't think it is fair to leave the defense of literature to the people who create it. In the same way that I think it is wrong to leave the defense of women's rights to women, as though, well, it's your problem, you sort it out. Because, women magically turn out to be mothers or sisters or aunts. And this idea of sectioning the society into interest groups that must fight their corner is a profoundly anti-democratic idea. And I think that that's part of what is at stake here. So I am not particularly disposed to one category or the other, but I like to think that I would defend a world in which they are all present. Therefore, it doesn't really matter whether I read that kind of book or like that kind of book. I need to show up, and all of us need to show up. And we need to show up for books that we don't even like, and that we read and thought it was a terrible book. I mean, I'm in favor of disappearing many books. It's just that my taste won't be yours, and this is the democratic attitude that we need to take. So what should we do? We should widen our reading. We should engage with each other more often. We should take up collective action. We should see that as a democratic response to this very narrow and strident aspect of the culture. And I think the giveaway is that the people who challenge books, there was a wonderful line, I'll make it slightly differently, a rather cruel line, but I liked it, that Khalil Gibran was the favorite poet of people who hated poetry. And which I unfortunately agreed with. But the book banning is the favorite activity of people who hate books. And at the end of the day, you have to decide which side you fall under. The great American critic Lionel Trilling had this wonderful line about the moral obligation to be intelligent. And I think that with intelligence of that sort, he meant cultural literacy, engagement, a sort of wide appreciation of the history of your society, what's going on at the cultural level, labor, politics, not this little siloed idea of reading high art. And that needs to return to this culture. And people need to dig in and realize that the foothills, the child's book that has two same-sex guinea pigs, which is one of the things that Mr. LaRue talks about. Someone is outraged that these two male guinea pigs have a wedding, and there's a children's story about it. And he has to point out that there's no part, the Constitution remains silent on same-sex marriage between guinea pigs, which I think is a great point. But you have to weigh in on these things because they might seem trivial, but they're not. This is someone making their living and being deprived of their livelihood by someone who hates books and is tearing down an institution that we should all love. And that has to be the approach that we take collectively, I think.
I would say that Freedom to Read Week is a celebration, and having access to reading materials is a right that we have here in this country and that we celebrate. But for those of us on the front lines of intellectual freedom, it sometimes doesn't feel good. And I think there's that reality of facing the tension of what intellectual freedom means. And exactly that. Sometimes we're going to defend books we find absolutely disgusting. Osa Katchen, who's the chief librarian at Halifax Public Library, I heard in an interview recently say, read the thing you want to argue against, which I think is very wise and really makes you stretch your holds list into an area where you might not regularly go to. I think that's kind of where we have to go. We have to be ready to experience that tension, that discomfort, to not hide away from conversations like this. I think just the fact that there are so many people in this room and online tonight is an incredible achievement and a reflection of what we're willing to look into the face of right now in this country, which I think brings me some hope. And but there is a discomfort here. This isn't, a holding of the torch and a going forward courageously. It is sometimes facing the fact that there's gross things out there that are still legal and people still have a right to read. And it is part of this process.
I also think it's, for me anyway, helpful to sort of keep in mind that many of the books that are being challenged now are books that didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. I mean, the publishers are putting out so many more diverse books, so many more books now for children with queer characters, with Black characters, Indigenous characters, people of color. Yeah, these are the books that are being challenged and banned, but also these books exist, and they didn't 20 years ago. So that's I think, a huge victory, and I think something to keep in mind and something to continue celebrating. And that, when I had a recent conversation with some teens, and one of the things they talked about was wanting to see more people talking about why books matter to them and why particular books matter to them, and for people to understand, what it means when you never see yourself in a book and what message you take from that. And what it means when you actually finally find a book where you do see yourself, and that's such an important thing for people to understand why that's important for children, and what the effect is when you don't have that. One teen who was maybe 13 or 14 said, when you never see yourself on the page, you start to feel like you're weird, you're abnormal, there's something wrong with you. Like, why are there no books about people like you? So I think talking about those books that do speak to you, and continuing to sort of boost those books and share those books, I think that's really important as well.
What else should we talk about?
How
are we doing?
I love what...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, are we over time?
No. Keep going.
I was going to say that I would go even further than what Robin said. I am from the West Indies. I grew up in a black society. My world is black in almost every appreciable way. And then I went through an English boarding school in English. So I went from a black world to a white world, which is a very confusing and disempowering experience. And I remembered the day that I read Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. And it was the first time in my life, in my thought world, that I read about black agency. And it was the most fantastic story. Obscure slaves defeating an empire. It was the sort of the Star Wars of that time. And I remember closing that book and thinking that was the book that made me a West Indian. Now, so things operate even beyond the narrow segments of a racial I'm not Haitian, but the larger pattern of the West Indies and its history was so deeply involved in C.L.R. James is Trinidadian, and so the cultural power of books is something that we have forgotten, and we have, I think, narrow casted the literary distribution system too much. But the sheer spiritual force of books is something that we are in danger of forgetting. They uncover a world, they change you. Marlon James, the Jamaican who won the Booker Prize, he said, the marvelous thing about a book is you could be reading it and it could be changing you and nobody could know, because you look the same, but you walk away a different person. And this is a transformative thing. It's a magical property. And we look for it in all the wrong places, in drugs and alcohol and so on. But it's right there in the library. And we should be defending that because, there's nothing to supersede it in the culture.
And I think just picking up on that, a child's right to read and the ability for a child to identify with character and story is so important. And, we've reflected on, when I was a child, there were so many red-headed little girls getting into mischief and trouble, and there definitely wasn't an access problem for me. But if at 8 years old or so, someone said, we're pulling all the books on mischievous red-headed girls because that is bad, for whatever reason, I mean, to think about what is happening to these kids who see themselves in a book and then are told, actually, we're banning that whole section. Actually, we have to put a sticker on all of those books so that the straight white children aren't offended or don't accidentally come across them. It's devastating to think about what happens to them as they grow up, as they perhaps reject an identity or don't come into their own identity in a way that they should be given the freedom to do. It's so tragic to think of, and I think that's a piece of these book challenges that we need to be mindful of.
Did you have another thought?
No.
Okay.
Well, many, but no.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the questions, is there anything that we should be talking about before we wrap up this section, before we go to questions that we haven't explored yet? Or
I'm a little weary of forgetting that we read books to encounter things that we would never actually want to encounter in real life. And Martin Amis was very good in this. He said, he wrote a sort of low comedy filled with violent criminal characters and so on, which he loved. And he said, isn't it a pleasure to be up close under people that you would avoid in a pub and actually, watch them as they smoke their filthy cigarettes? And but there is a sort of high-minded rationale for this. The famous line in Keats's Notebooks where he talks about negative capability, and he said that Shakespeare took as much pleasure in the creation of an Imogen as an Iago. And I think this is how we used to read books, that you would read the most appalling, Scandinavian crime books. They're truly disturbing things. And, people are addicted to them. And the people who are addicted to them would faint at the sight of blood, So there is a deep pleasure that books offer us in exposure to things that we could never actually put up with in real life. And that part of the danger of embracing a censorious culture is that you are, without thinking about it, you are actually pushing these books further away from you. That you can be doing that.
And I think that includes children as well. I'm thinking about was it Lizzie's Lion, right? The burying the burglar's head in the yard. And I remember a book I had as a child, which I think was actually written by a child, and it ends with the pirates ate poisoned cheese, the pirates died, the cat died. That was the end of the book. I loved this book. I don't know why, but I love this book. I mean, look how dark a lot of fairy tales are, right? And the original versions of the fairy tales are extremely dark. And I think sometimes people think that they need to protect kids from certain things that kids are actually more than capable of dealing with and perhaps actually need, So I think that's also that it's not just adults who like yes. To read about things that they wouldn't actually want to experience and are very capable of distinguishing between what's a story they're enjoying reading and what is an experience they want to have. And they don't expect those two things to be the same. So.
Great. Any other thoughts? If not, we can think about questions. Why not? Would anyone have any questions? You can go approach the microphone, and then we can hear you better.
Probably the most spectacular literary event of the last century was Harry Potter. And what has happened to the author and to Harry Potter's books, because kids can't handle witches and Hogwarts and everything else, is a reflection maybe of a very, very major problem that we're facing. I'd love to hear your comments on the incredible impact of Harry Potter and the incredible impact of society back on Harry Potter.
I'll go last.
I'm curious. It could go in actually so many directions. Because Harry Potter has been challenged in many schools and public libraries because of witchcraft and paganism and a number of other things. And then, of course, because of the artist herself and some transphobic comments and all of that. And I mean, from a library perspective, go look up if your library still has books by Bill Cosby in it. I bet they do. We haven't had... It's not grounds for pulling a book from a collection because we don't like the author anymore. Otherwise, half of our collections might be empty. But certainly, there are grounds for when books are removed from a library, which would include plagiarism or would include misinformation or something that comes out to doubt the accuracy behind a book. But for a work like Harry Potter, it's still on a regular basis being taken out from the library. Kids around the world are still obsessed with Potter World and all of the lore. It's a fantastical world. Why wouldn't you be? The parents that I know, I have many friends who are parents of trans children who are Harry Potter fans as well. And the way that they approach those conversations, and I'm sure might be happening with children's librarians as well, is just to say, we're going to enjoy this work for what it is, but we're also going to recognize what's happened with this author and have a conversation. It's not a matter of ignoring that it's happened or the conversation that J.K. Rowling is having online with her fans and with others. I think it's an opportunity to learn more and an opportunity to face some ugly facts about what's happening in the world. Does that answer your question at all? Robin, do you have anything to add? Yeah. Okay.
Robin, are you weighing in?
If you like.
Well, I thought I was going to get through the evening without being stepping into, yes, JK'd. I'm more of a free speech absolutist on this point, and I think that J.K. Rowling is entitled to her opinions, and I think she has held them quite courageously in the face of enormous pressure. Whether I agree with them or not is irrelevant, but it would ill become a free expression organization to run in panic from somebody who had an opinion. We have, this is an important point. I can't speak to the magic witchcraft side of it, but I completely agree with Michelle that if we start introducing morality into which authors make the cut and don't make the cut, we will be purging libraries constantly for the next couple of decades. And I think that we have to evolve the conversation a bit more, that like Evelyn Waugh, one of my favorite writers, an absolutely appalling human being, Philip Roth, another, dreadful. But, you know, I will fight you to the death if you try to take away my books, because the artist and the man or the woman, they're different things. And it's only people who have given up a profound engagement with literature that make these easy splits and go after the author. Sure, the author may have terrible opinions, but I don't think that's a reason to cancel them and purge their books and so on. That's a hill I'm willing to die on.
I guess I'm kind of glad that question came up, because you kind of addressed what my question is. What concerns me, we've been talking, this conversation has really been centered on challenges from the left, or from the right, but there's plenty of challenges of books that come from the left. And sometimes it's not even clear if it's a left-right thing. And if you could just talk a little bit about how we teach children to engage with ideas that they don't understand, they don't agree with, and maybe even parents don't agree with. How do you wrestle with that with your children if you come across an idea you think is dangerous or you don't necessarily want to expose your children to, but you also want to teach them it's okay to engage with ideas that you don't agree with?
I actually have a clever thing that somebody else wrote that I'll just toss in and then pass the microphone. James LaRue says, in the middle of one of these very contentious challenges, somebody sends him this comment: we're trying to child-proof the world. Shouldn't we be trying to world-proof the child? And I thought, that's it. Nothing more to add. So,
mic drop. Yes. Drop the mic. We got to close it up. You're 100% right. We do see challenges coming from the left, and we see just this past year we had a school board that didn't want to participate in Freedom to Read Week because they were trying to advocate more for equitable collections in their schools. And I kind of listened and thought, and like, how do those two things not go together? And so there was an insinuation that by championing intellectual freedom and the freedom to read, that they were giving platform to books that might confront or rebut something in their equitable collections, which is 100% possible. But isn't that an excellent conversation to have? Isn't that an excellent, aren't those debate skills, those conversation skills, those listening skills, those empathy skills so essential to demonstrate to kids, to get them practicing with each other? I think that is so important to this future generation, is not just to sit quietly and wait for your turn to talk, but to learn to listen to who is doing the talking, and to empathize with, because, you know, we have more in common than we do uncommon in this world. And I think by looking for those little differences, we're just causing ourselves more undue harm. And I'm getting lost, so Robin, you go.
No, I was actually just wondering if it might be useful for you to say something about the curation aspect, like how libraries choose books or make decisions about what to acquire, because I think there is sometimes some confusion around, you know, obviously libraries don't buy every book, and obviously libraries don't continue to add more and more books without ever removing anything from the collection, because obviously that wouldn't work.
Our floors do have orchids, and they will bust at some point.
But I didn't know much about how that actually worked, and so it's been interesting for me to kind of reading a little online about that process of curation and weeding and so on. So maybe.
Yeah. And there has been a conversation about, you know, the difference between a public library and a school library and what they collect. And for those who don't know, public libraries have collection development policies that dictates what goes into the collection. And schools generally have a policy that the school library supports the curriculum of that school board or of that province's curriculum. And so those mean very different things. That means that a public library's collection policy might mandate that, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird, which might have been printed 5 years ago, even though its copyright is older than that, is allowed to stay in the collection if it's in good condition. But a school library might actually be looking for a more recent work to teach that, whatever that thing is from To Kill a Mockingbird that we're teaching. Are we trying to teach about the Black experience through To Kill a Mockingbird? Or is there something specific in the style of Harper Lee's writing that we're learning from that book? Those are two very different things, two very different curriculums. If you're trying to teach about the Black experience, you maybe don't want to be using To Kill a Mockingbird. You might want to teach something by a Black author with lived experience in that area. So it's something to consider when we're hearing about books that are being pulled from libraries. We call it weeding in library land. And essentially it means we're getting rid of the older, used, you know, in some cases tattered and unreadable books to make room for newer material. It doesn't always mean newly printed, newly written. It could be that we're replacing classics, but you know, there is a cycle of life. Paper is, I could pour water on this very old and lovely book. I won't do it, I promise. But it's not indestructible. It has a shelf life. And so we have to cycle them out. And we have policies around what goes into libraries, what goes out of libraries. Those collections are monitored by very well-trained library staff who choose, there is a human who chooses books in libraries. And sometimes they are aided by collection guides and that kind of thing. But, you know, there's someone behind the collection doing that work. This isn't just something that happens by magic or by, goodness gracious, by donation. It's happening because a professional is choosing those books and putting them in that space. Would
you like a mic?
Yeah. I'm just following up on what you're saying here. I'm sitting and thinking of what you were saying, and I was thinking of AI, which is not a person, but it is a technical piece of equipment that is writing this book. How can you ban? Can you ban a AI book? Or how do you get into the algorithms to make sure that the books are appropriately broadly ranged? I'm just curious whether there's been a lot of thought in the library writer area about the implications of AI in book banning, because surely all AI books are perfect books, so therefore none of them should be banned.
Brendan had a story about AI being used. You had a story about AI being used in book banning, didn't you?
I did. But I'm not going to tell that story. Kyle Chaker of The New Yorker just wrote a book that I've just read, Filter World, in which he looks at the impact of AI on the culture. And after reading it, I realized that a lot of the, you know, human trolls are like the embodiment of an algorithm, because they are trying to push you in a direction because of an unconscious drive that has surfaced in the society. And he shows the flattening that algorithms have caused the culture. And I think that this is a problem that we haven't even got the vocabulary to discuss yet. The Citizen Lab did a report on the consequences of AI in the Canadian immigration system, which, if you are sleeping too well at night, I would recommend that you read, because they are outsourcing the processing of applications to become a Canadian, which is something I had to do as an immigrant, to these totally obscure processes. So if whatever they have derived their algorithm from doesn't like people of a certain hue or a certain religion, a certain... nobody's purging them, because we are all purging them collectively through an algorithm. And I think that is probably the better way to think of algorithms. They are the distillation of everything that we are uncomfortable about, but at an unconscious level. And the data extraction doesn't balk at this at all, and it just pulls it. So AI is going to write some really frightening stuff, and I'm afraid that we are now in a culture that responds to this sort of clickbait style provocation so well that we need to think very, very carefully about where we... I mean, you think Scandinavian thrillers are scary. Wait till you get the AI version. That's my feeling about it, that it's just a way of pushing us further and further into areas, sadism and so on, that I'm not particularly interested in us going down.
I mean, I have seen AI-written children's books, but they're not traditionally published. And the attempts I've seen of people using AI to write children's books have resulted in some pretty terrible books. It's hard to imagine at this point any of those being traditionally published or ending up in a library or in a situation where they would be challenged for anything other than horrendously bad writing. So, yeah. But that doesn't mean we won't get to that point. So.
But we have had this issue of self-published books for several years now, because it's quite easy to print and bind pages. Who knew? And so we get some pretty interesting self-published work that you can find on Amazon and a number of different distributors. But most collection development policies in libraries will have requirements around publication, publishers, publishing houses that we know to be reputable, because when a work goes through a publisher, you know that it's gone through a series of steps. It's been edited, it's been fact-checked, it's been proofed in a number of ways, especially if we're talking nonfiction. But there's a level of professionalism that's expected when it's gone through a publishing house as opposed to being self-published. And so we're particularly aware of that with nonfiction work or with things that involve health or misinformation of, just terrible work that can come from self-publishing. I'm not that worried about AI, because have you ever tried to ask ChatGPT to write anything? I mean, it's not good. It still requires a human, let's say. It may be a place to start, but it's certainly not a place to end and press print.
Well, on that note, we have time for one more question, or two. I see two. Okay. If you want to go to the mics, it'd be great. Then we could hear you, and I think that'll be time to wrap it up at the end of those three.
Hello. All right. I know this has been addressed earlier, and I thank you for mentioning the World's Most Dangerous book, because I read that and I loved it. Do you think authors really should be louder on this? Because I know you talked about how the authors shouldn't really defend themselves, and they just put out their work. But I really haven't heard much from authors who do sell a lot of books, who do have their work in libraries. I mean, you mentioned Rushdie. Now, I don't know if you know this story, but when the Satanic Verses came out, one chain of bookstores tried to pull it. They said they wouldn't stock it, they wouldn't have any of that in their shelves. Stephen King went to that book chain and said, if you pull his book, I'm taking all of mine out. Lo and behold, Rushdie is back on the shelf. I think writers have more... We mentioned Harry Potter. We mentioned J.K. Rowling. I mean, writers have more power than we might think. I mean, I used to be a student here. I mean, I've met writers obscure in I met Zadie Smith, and I've met others here in Montreal, and I'm a McGill alum. Hey, all right. So I think, and I'm trying to write online too. But I think writers really should speak up. I think writers should get out there, and especially in Canada. Like you mentioned, Margaret Atwood. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale is massively popular. I mentioned Stephen King. I mean, you could insert your own favorite writer, maybe not Dan Brown or what have you, but I think more writers should get involved in this, and that's just my opinion, and I wanted to get some feedback on that. Thank you.
I just want to jump in on the answer because I feel duty bound. Margaret Atwood is the founder of PEN Canada and has spent 40 years defending writers all over the world, as did Graham Gibson, her partner. I fear I have phrased my response poorly. I was not suggesting that writers should not defend their books. I was saying it should not be left only for them. And absolutely, PEN is based on the idea that there's a global confraternity of writers, and that whether you are a nameless journalist in Ciudad Juarez or a Nobel Prize winner, you are equal in the eyes of PEN. You're a working writer, and we defend you.
There are definitely groups of authors organizing. There's a group called Authors Against Book Bans who've been organizing to try to set up, chapters in different areas so that they can respond locally, so that when there is a challenge locally, there's a group of people in that area who can respond. That's particularly in the children's literature world because so many of the challenges right now are being aimed at children's books and teen books. But I think that work is definitely happening. What I would like to see, though, is when I go to those meetings, what I'm seeing is a lot of authors whose books have been challenged. And that's mainly Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ writers. I would like to see more writers whose books are not currently being challenged speaking up and taking on this issue. So, yeah. And I mean, some are, but I think we need a lot more of that. Yeah.
You had a question.
It's a slightly different. I'm a studying writer. I poetry so far. I'm a queer writer. I write about the experience as a gay man. I have a book coming out. It's talking about an abusive relationship in poetry. And so one of the reasons I wanted to come to this lecture and listen to the round table is that I know I'm walking into this firing line. As some point out, it's a world that's becoming more hostile, especially to LGBT topics, and more litigious about banning books. So I just wanted to ask, it's frankly terrifying. Do you have any advice for somebody who's walking into the firing line in a world that might be getting worse on that subject?
I would just say find community, connect with other writers, connect with other poets, try to connect with, just with communities so that you have a group of people that around you that you can talk about that with, that you can support each other, that if you're doing events or launches, that you can do those as a group rather than solo, that you have people to bounce things off, if issues do arise. There's a huge amount of support as well. So as I said before, although there's the opposition is sometimes very vocal, it doesn't represent the majority. I think there's lots of people who want to read your stories and your poems. So don't. I think one of the things that we can do to fight back against all this is to refuse to censor ourselves. So, if we stop writing, then the people who are challenging the books kind of win, right? So I think the way we minimize the impact of all this is to continue to write the poems, write the stories, get them out there, find readers, connect with other writers, build community. And that work is so important. So I would just encourage you to do what you need to do to make that happen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just briefly, two things. PEN has spent 100 years supporting writers who are facing imprisonment, execution, all sorts of terrible things. And the basic message that we send all of them is you are not alone. So you have to work on that assumption that there are people just like you, and you will find them, and they will support you. And the second thing I was going to say, a lovely line from Churchill, when you're going through hell, keep going.
And then there was another question. Did you have a question?
The microphone too. Okay, thank you.
Merci, Guylaine.
There was no time. Actually, I have two things if there's time, but the first is technical, because you mentioned the Second Amendment. I have no idea what it is, and how does it relate to censorship?
It's the right to carry arms, and in an open carry state.
That's what I thought it
Yes.
related
Sorry,
to.
that was my opening remark. You must have been baffled for a long time. My point was that in Canada, you're never going to be in a room with an armed person who's objecting to a book that you've written, but that is quite possible in the US.
Okay.
And I think that lends a certain frisson that I would rather live without. And I think that is the sort of obvious distinction between the two cultures, that you know, how do you know that person's not going to shoot you?
Well,
Yeah.
but I have another question. When you mentioned the rewriting of Red Riding Hood, this has happened with classics, with other books. And isn't that another form of censorship or banning? If you're banning a story, you feel that it's not correct to use, yes, eh?
Well, we were just talking about this earlier, actually. So, for example, the Roald Dahl's books, some of them have been released in newer editions where some of the language has been changed because the original wording was considered to be offensive, and there was a concern that some parents wouldn't want to read the books to their kids with the original language. We were just talking about it earlier. So that was a business decision by a publisher. That wasn't a government body or a school or a publicly funded institution like a library choosing to censor. That was a publisher saying, hey, we make a lot of money from these books and sales are starting to tank because these books are kind of dated and people aren't wanting to read books to their kids that use this language, so let's release an updated version. So to my mind, that's not censorship. You can still find the original ones, but a parent who wants to read these books to their kids but doesn't want to read certain language that they are uncomfortable reading or that they consider to be offensive can find an updated version. So personally, I wouldn't consider that censorship, and I would think that's an individual decision for someone to decide whether they want to read the original or whether they want to read the updated version. But I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
The original Grimm's fairy tales were full of decapitation and cannibalism and so on. Wundertalen, I think they were called in German. Marina Warner, the British writer, did a lot of writing on this. And they were much too much for children then. But I actually think it comes back to children have a tolerance that we really don't know. And I rather like the idea of the woodsman slashing Granny out for a drink. I think that's a rather good update myself. So, you know, we can't be too picky about these things. But stories adapt and they change with us. I think we should learn to live with that.
Well, thank you so much for all of your good questions and for this excellent panel. Please join me in thanking them. And we'll turn it over to Laurie now. Yes, thank you.
Bonsoir. Good evening, everyone. Je suis Laurie Clauda, la vice-doyenne exécutive des bibliothèques ici à McGill, et j'ai le grand plaisir de remercier nos merveilleux conférenciers. Again, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brendan, Robin, Michelle, and our colleague Joseph, for such an important conversation. McGill Library strives to be a safe, inclusive space for readers, for students, for researchers, and it was fascinating to hear about book challenges, book banning, from a wide variety of perspectives, including public libraries, academic institutions, and beyond. It was really great. So I have little gifts, so please accept these tokens of our gratitude. You can take a little piece of McGill Libraries home with you. My gratitude to the Friends of the Library for their support year in and year out, and for the organization of thought-provoking events like this one. Special thanks to Lenore Harris for her leadership, the Friends Events Committee, and the Library Events team, who are also here, for their work. And thanks to our McGill colleagues in multimedia and University Advancement for their support of Friends events. Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival has been a fabulous longtime partner of the Hugh MacLennan Lecture. I encourage you to check out their program of events this week featuring world-renowned authors and thinkers. Thanks also to Paragraph Bookstore for once again partnering with the Friends. Robin's books are available for purchase online on their website. This evening is made possible thanks to the generous support of Donald Walcot, immediate past chair of the Friends. Thank you, Don. Don, thank you for making vital topics like tonight's accessible to the McGill community and far beyond it. And thank you all for joining us this evening, both in person and virtually. Bonne soirée. Thanks.